Hello, welcome back to the World Canon podcast. Today's episode is the final installment of our Civil War Grant versus Lee series. I'm really excited to get this wrapped up and move on to more guest-oriented things, but maybe we'll do some more sort of solo series, sort of in-depth, long-term series on a specific topic in the future, especially if I get any recommendations. I'd be happy to consider those. Not too much housekeeping other than Alex, actually, if you remember him, the guy who's on every single guest episode. I just released a new single called Breathe, so go check that out. It's pretty good. I love, this might be a slightly biased opinion, but I like his stuff. I'll include a link in the description to make it easier to find. But yeah, I mean, that's really it. After this, it's going to be mostly guest episodes and probably be hearing from Alex a lot more often and a few other people. I'm hoping to get them on. Don't really want to give anything away, especially if something falls through, because that'd be awkward. But yeah, really, without further ado, this is Grant versus Lee, the Siege of Petersburg, Part 2, and the surrender at Hold on, this word is hard to pronounce. Appomattox Courthouse. This is sort of just kind of chucking the last two parts in together for a big, long episode. On July 30th at 3:45 a.m., Colonel Pleasant lights the fuse to 8,000 pounds of black powder buried a few dozen feet beneath the Confederate lines around Petersburg. He runs out of the mine and waits for the charge to explode. But nothing happens. The fuse happens to have gone out. The fuse they were given was a dud. Now they had a dilemma. Dawn was coming, and if the mine weren't exploded beforehand, then the attacking force waiting in position under cover of early morning darkness would be revealed, and their plan would go down the drain. The fuse would have to be relit, but who would they send? Chances were it could reignite on its own, and whoever was in there would be blown to bits and buried under dozens of feet of dirt and rubble. Colonel Pleasant, not wanting to send anyone to do what he wouldn't, and deciding they couldn't wait any longer or else have to cancel the attack and ditch the plan entirely, walks into the mine. Everyone watching waits with bated breath, expecting it to explode any second and Pleasant to never be seen again. But after what seemed like hours, the colonel comes ducking out of the mine, giving the all-go, and finally, at 4:44 a.m., 8,000 pounds of black powder ignite, throwing earth, stone, cannons, rifles, and men hundreds of feet into the air, instantly killing almost 300 Confederates and injuring dozens more. As the dust began to settle, just enough for visibility, Yankee troops began charging towards the now gaping hole in the Confederate lines. Leading the way was Brigadier General James H. Ledlie. He had replaced Brigadier General Edward Ferrero's division, made up of black soldiers who had not had any combat experience thus far, but had trained for weeks to lead the assault. However, a day before the explosion, they had been swapped for Ledlie's division of white troops. This had initially caused outrage with belief that it was purely a racial motive, but Ledlie's men were more experienced, though Ledlie himself was an ill-fit leader. Either way, Ferrero's division were about to be happy they were replaced. As the Confederate troops gather themselves, some stumbling their ways to the edge of the massive hole, creating a 60-foot wide chasm between their line. On the other side of the crater, through the hazy falling dust, a massive wave of blue was rushing towards them. As the first line crested the edge of the hole, the Southern troops on the other side, now being joined by others further behind the defenses who had been awoken by the explosion. It looked like nothing would stop the Union attackers from crashing through the dazed Confederates. The Southerners gathered at the edge, ready to make their last stand, when the wave of blue never hit them. Looking down to the crater, they saw blue on blue, the men in front being pressed against a 30-foot wall of earth, unable to climb the steep edge as more and more of their own rushed over the other side into the hole, forcing those trapped in front from being able to retreat. The surefire plan had now turned into a death trap for the Federals, who realized this at the same time as the Confederates, who were quick now to rally and, just like the crater at Vicksburg, began pouring fire into the hole, not even bothering to aim most of the time. Cannons were rolled up to the crater and used to fire into the Union troops nearly point blank. One artillery unit even broke out a mortar and began lobbing shells into the swaying mass. Even more intense, some were even throwing empty muskets with bayonets as spears. Soon reinforcements arrived, which were sent by Lee, who watched the onslaught through looking glasses. Virginians and Georgian troops rushed onto the field, routing the Federals who were trying to press around the edge of the crater. The combat inevitably turned to hand-to-hand fighting, while the Virginians firing point-blank volleys into the Federals and turning to their bayonets to kill the few who made it to the top. Finally, after hours of massacre, at around 1:30 p.m., the gore ended, with the Union suffering over 3,800 casualties, and the Confederates only 1,200, including those who died in the explosion. The scene in the crater was described as being brutal, worse than even the scene following the bloody angle. Gore and blood pooled in the bottom of the hole as bodies upon bodies laid on top of one another. Just like at Vicksburg, the plan to blow a crater in the enemy line and charge through backfired. These guys really just wanted the idea to work, and why not? It sounds good in your head. The same tactic would be used over 50 years later in the trenches of World War I by the British at the Battle of Lochnagar. Once again, to not much success, though. With this plan exhausted and thousands dead or missing, the Union soldiers moved back to their camps, nursing their wounds, and Grant, along with Meade, went back to the drawing board. Meanwhile, the edges of the crater were being turned into earthworks, and the hole in the Confederate line was now being thoroughly patched by Lee himself. To rub salt in the wound, Confederate General Early was carrying out his own invasion of the North at this time and had just sacked the town of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, and he now threatened Maryland and Washington, D.C. Grant would have to send a force to deal with Early, which Lee knew, so he sent his nephew Fitzhugh with his cavalry and an infantry division from Anderson's corps, who was defending Richmond a few miles to the north. When Grant got reports from across the James River, he assumed this meant that all of Anderson's corps was marching and leaving Richmond with only a few defenders. He decides to try attacking through Deep Bottom again, this time for real. On August 14th, the 10th and 2nd Corps, led by Hancock of the Potomac, were across the James, some crossing by steamboat that night. They slowly made their way into position for what they of course expected to be a relatively easy fight, but first they had to march through the acrid southern heat, gaining casualties as some dropped dead from heat strokes. Once they were ready, the order was given to advance, and the Federals were quickly surprised by the resistance. What they thought would only be pickets and a thinned-out brigade actually turned out to be a full division. This didn't stop them, though, and the 2nd Corps attacked a cavalry position at a spot called Fussell's Mill. They managed to rout the horsemen and move on the trenches behind them, capturing some enemy artillery. By now, Lee was aware of the threat to Richmond, and he sent reinforcements of 2 infantry brigades. On August 16th, cavalry on both sides met at Charles City Road and fought the whole day, neither side gaining a huge advantage over the other and casualties piling up. The 10th Corps, however, were able to wedge a gap in the Confederate lines, but just as a stroke of bad luck, the terrain in which they had created that gap was so thick in vegetation that neither Hancock nor the other generals were able to even realize the massive advantage they had just made, and the gap was resealed by the Confederate defenders before anyone knew. Lee grew tired of Union forces trying to cure through Deep Bottom and planned a counterattack for the 18th. At 11 a.m., Confederate forces converged on the Union's right flank, but almost no gain was made. Eventually, the Yankees could no longer take the heat, literally. The August temperatures were causing almost as many casualties as the guns and cannons. Men were dropping from dehydration and heat stroke. Hancock figured they couldn't keep up an effective assault if they were taking so many casualties like that, and on August 20th, he withdrew across the James River, having suffered almost 3,000 casualties, while the Confederates suffered 1,500. For the next 3 months, the two armies are held in a Loctite stalemate. All the while, officers come to Grant and Meade with a bright idea on how to quickly end the siege. The Potomac is desperate to end the war before the election, but with the Confederate stubbornness, that was unlikely. Their next best bet was to at least make good enough progress to increase Lincoln's standing in the polls so that he'd be elected again. Because, once again, if he lost, the war would likely come to a ceasefire and the nation permanently divided. Not all the Confederates were so stubborn, though. By the later months of the siege, Lee was suffering more casualties by desertion than disease or actual fighting. Men from the Southern armies had had enough. Most were starving and realized the war was lost in only a matter of time. Farmers had crops to get home to, and many had just been away from home longer than they could handle. Still, those that remained were the most devout and would defend their posts to the last man if ordered to. Plus, by the slightest chance, McClellan might just win the U.S. presidential race, giving the South the out it needed. Finally, November comes, and the polls are up. Both sides anxiously wait to hear the news from D.C., and on November 8th, 1864, the winner is announced. And obviously, you probably already know, Lincoln won. Now, the Potomac had its green light to do whatever it needed to win. Any Yankees or rebels who might have looked forward to the possibility of going home were sorely disappointed, made even worse by the onset of winter. The already still siege became even stiller. Even with the military and technology advancements that came with the Civil War, not much could be done during the winter time. Both sides had to hunker down and wait to make their next move come spring. The defenders in Petersburg, though, would suffer harshly. Already, most of them were starving and barefoot with old tattered uniforms. Now they were freezing and succumbing to frostbite. Between winter and those who had been baking on a political turnover in D.C., desertion skyrocketed. Finally, by March, things were thawing out and plans were being put into place. The Confederates needed to break the siege. The Army of North Virginia had been dwindled down to around 50,000. Probably less, whereas the Potomac had over 125,000. Currently stationed at Petersburg with General Sheridan, who just finished raiding his way through the Shenandoah Valley, returning with an additional 50,000. In order to stand a chance against those odds and make it out with enough numbers, they would have to make a surprise attack. On the far north side of the lines around Petersburg, near the Appomattox River, the Union had built a siege fort of their own named Fort Stedman, a strong point of earthworks and guns. It was also the nearest point in the entire 70-mile line to the enemy's earthworks, close enough to talk to the other side. General B. Gordon, who commanded the stretch of Confederate defenses facing Fort Stedman, had actually been working on a plan for weeks and presented it to Lee on March 23rd. He would conduct an early morning attack while it was still dark. He had several reasons for believing attacking the strong point head-on was worth it. First, there weren't as many physical obstructions in the way. Back then, armies used a thing called chevaux de frise, or frise, I'm not entirely sure, which is a fancy French term for spiky sticks. These were essentially a Napoleon-era version of barbed wire. They were made of a series of vertical crisscross poles sharpened to a fine point with a center pole running horizontal for support. These wouldn't stop troops exactly, the same as barbed wire, but because they could be chopped apart or just picked up and moved, but they could slow down large forces quite a bit. Second, which is the real kicker, was that the Union's main railway supply depot was only a mile behind Fort Stedman, which also led to a place called City Point, which just so happened to also be where Grant's headquarters were. Taking out a target like that could give the Virginian army an escape and prolong the war. Gordon's plan was greenlit and set for March 25th. At 4:15 a.m., 100 hand-picked men, armed with empty muskets to avoid accidental firing, rushed the Union line between two of their main batteries, 10 and 11. They took the present defenders by complete surprise and fanned out, half going to one battery and the other half attacking the next. Union General McLaughlin, who was in charge of Fort Stedman, realized he was under attack and quickly rode to Battery 12. There he ordered them to fire on Battery 11, which he thought was the only breach in his line, and sent infantry to recapture it. After, he rode to the supposedly recaptured battery and began ordering men into positions, only to realize the men he was ordering were actually the enemy. A group of Confederates quickly seized him and ushered him back to their lines, where he surrendered himself to General Gordon. Once the Southerners had fully seized Fort Stedman, General Gordon moved up personally with the rest of the attacking force through what was now a 1,000-foot wide gap in the Union defenses. Things for the Union defenders were complete confusion, whose artillery began firing on their own positions, assuming them to be captured. However, the tables were about to be flipped. Gordon had sent several other 100-man groups to attack further into the enemy's rear, but they had gotten somewhat lost and were by now enjoying the captured rations after starving all winter. Between incredibly confusing trench systems and too many distractions, Gordon's attack had the effect of being too successful and came to a screeching halt. This gave the Union commander in charge after McLaughlin's capture, General Hartranft, the ability to form a decisive counterattack. First, he orders his remaining field artillery to bombard the captured batteries. As the artillery kept the Confederates at bay, he organized new lines to completely halt them. Eventually, around 7:30 a.m., the lead Confederate attackers began returning to Gordon, who was hunkered down at Fort Stedman, reporting extremely heavy resistance. Gordon realized at this point they'd bitten off more than they could chew and had even failed to reach the Union supply depot, which was their main target. He begins issuing orders for retreat, and the rebel soldiers scramble back across no man's land as almost 2,000 of them are taken prisoner in the process. As prisoners from the attack are marched to the rear of the Union lines, they come across a man they would never expect. President Abraham Lincoln had been present at Grant's headquarters the entire time, even during what they thought was a huge upswing in the fighting and so close to Union headquarters. Lincoln reported back to his office that evening and morning had been rather uneventful, except for a little rumpus, quote, unquote, on the northern end of the line. Ultimately, the attack on Fort Stedman had been the last straw. Lee realized they had no hope in staying at Petersburg and began preparing for a full-scale retreat. He sent word to Richmond for the Confederate government to do the same. On April 1st, Grant attacks the city's defenses at a place called Five Forks in a crushing victory. Within the following 2 days, Petersburg surrenders, and Lee ushers what's left of his army northwest in retreat. The siege of Petersburg had taken a total of 10 months, claiming over 70,000 casualties. The Army of North Virginia, the last major fighting force of the Confederate military, was withered down to a husk of its former self, taking most casualties through form of desertion. Most of those remaining, knew it was only a short matter of time before their full surrender, while a minority was prepared to take to the hills and carry out guerrilla warfare, though that opportunity would not come. For the next 10 days, both armies marched west along the Appomattox River in what's known as the Appomattox Campaign. If the Southern Army were to stand a chance, they would need to be able to resupply. Efforts were made by those in Richmond to send supplies to their army of now 30,000. They would rendezvous with a wagon train of food, ammo, and cannons. However, on April 5th, the convoy was attacked by Union cavalry and totally lost. Now, Lee was not only without any fresh supplies, but blocked on his original course. He changed his course to a town called Farmville, 23 miles west, where he was promised 80,000 rations for his starving men. Over the course of those 23 miles, the two armies would engage several times, inflicting even more casualties. At one point, a desperate attempt was made by the Confederates, barely stopping a Union raiding party from burning a high bridge across the river before the rest of the Confederates could cross. Finally, on April 7th, the Army of North Virginia stumbles its way into the outskirts of Farmville, only to find Grant had already established headquarters there. That night, Lee gets a letter asking for his surrender. Lee responds asking for terms, but still holds out in hope they could somehow escape. Some fighting ensues the next day, but the vigor is diminished as the Union soldiers know their enemy is on the verge of surrender. They hope to just wait them out a little longer. Now held up at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee hoped to get supplies from a train, but then receives news that the train was captured and burned by a Union cavalry general named George Custer, the same last stand at Little Bighorn Custer. Now, the only option was to try to outrun the Union army, heading west, once again, and on empty stomachs. But after another lost fight on April 9th, the Southern Army and Lee were done. They had been dwindled down beyond repair, and their capital was lost, and that they had been pushed so far west that eventually they'd hit the Mississippi River. Lee finally succumbs to the inevitable, and at 3 p.m. on April 9th, 1865, he and two subordinates are escorted to the McLean House, where he meets with Grant and his staff. The terms of surrender are actually quite generous, as ordered by Abraham Lincoln, who now had the task of rebuilding a nation that had just been at war with itself for 4 years. His first initiative was to reinstate every state that had seceded back into the Union without any sort of punishment or malice repercussions. Of course, they would have to obey all U.S. laws and observe the Constitution, and this, of course, meant the total abolition of slavery. The soldiers and officers of the Army of North Virginia would not be taken prisoner, but put on a parole-like state, allowed to return home and left alone, and with all personal belongings, including weapons. The only weapons to be surrendered would be public or government-issued rifles and munitions. At 4 p.m., the surrender was finalized and signed, essentially ending the American Civil War. Lee returned to his army with rations from the Appomattox supplies given to him by Grant to carry out the business of dismantling his army. There were still some smaller battles like Columbus, Georgia on April 6th, the one day after Lincoln's death, and other Southern armies like the Army of Tennessee led by General Johnson that didn't surrender until April 26th. But once news of Lee's surrender spread, Southern forces surrendered as soon as it hit them. Lincoln's Vice President Andrew Johnson brought the hammer down after Lincoln's assassination, making sure that any more fighting or resistance would immediately cease, while still holding to Lincoln's no malice approach. On May 10th, Confederate President Jefferson Davis was arrested by Union soldiers. Finally, the very last battle was on May 13th at Palmetto Ranch, and the surrender of the Trans-Mississippi Department. Lee's surrender had marked the end of the war for the North, though, and many considered everything else as just mopping up the mess. On November 6th, the very last Confederate military entity surrendered. The CSS Shenandoah one of the only surviving Confederate Navy ships, had been sailing around the world, basically pirating whoever, until they finally got news of the surrender and came into port. And just to add the cherry on top, because it's funny, Texas remained in a state of war, though there was no more fighting for a full year after Lee's surrender, before they were finally done on August 20th, 1866. Well, there you have it, folks. That is the end of Grant versus Lee. That has been nearly 6 months in the making, and honestly, I feel relieved to be done. As fun as it was, it's nice to be done with this series. But yeah, like I said at the beginning, I think this is going to be, if not the end, at least a long break from this sort of solo series thing. From now on, it's going to be mostly guest-oriented episodes, as those are just better. You're definitely going to be hearing a lot more from Alex. And then, yeah, I had a few other people lined up. We'll see how those go, or if anything else happens. But, I just want to say thank you so much for listening. Please, comment, like this. I know the YouTube is a little bit behind. I'm going to get back on trying to upload those the same time as the audio format episodes. But yeah, just do what you do. Like, comment, share this with other people. It really does help a lot. And I just appreciate whoever's listening. But yeah, we'll see you, or I guess you'll hear from us next time. Not exactly sure what the next episode is going to be yet. I have to figure out a releasing schedule for the next few, but keep your eyes and ears open. Yeah, thanks so much once again. Bye.